Okay, we're going to work through questions 19 through 25 as shown here in a copy of the textbook page. So question 19 says, find the slope of the tangent line to the graph of y equals x squared at the point indicated, and then write the corresponding equation of the tangent line. Okay, so if we're going to do question 19, in 19 I have the point -2, 4. And don't forget, for all of these, I am using y equals x squared, and I know that my slope will always be 2x. So, given this point, right away I can write y minus 4 equals, I'm going to leave a blank for the slope, x plus 2. Okay, my slope will be 2x. If my x is a -2, my slope will be -4. So I would encourage you, for every one of these problems, to give yourself the graph. Here, roughly, is the point -2, 4. Then I'm going to draw a tangent line to that curve, right at this point. And the red can be expressed as that equation. So that's question 19. If we did 20, we would use the same concepts. So let's do 20 on the next slide. Alright, for 20 I've set things up already. I have sketched my graph, and I've written out my problem, and I've started writing my line. So the last thing I need to do is figure out what the slope is. So I know because I'm on the parent parabola, the slope will always be 2x, and the x they gave me was -0.4. So my slope in this case will be -0.8, and that I'm going to put right here. So the equation of the red line is in the red box. So make sure that makes sense to you. And then we're going to go on to 21, which is working with fractions on the next slide. Okay, we have our point 4/3 and 16/9, and they've asked us to write the equation of the tangent line, and that's the red line pictured below. So the equation is going to be y minus 16/9 equals, I'm going to leave a space for my slope, x minus 4/3, and again my slope is going to equal 2x because I have the parabola, the parent parabola, and 2 times 4/3 is going to be 8/3. So I'm going to put 8/3 where I have the spot left for the slope, and that red line in this red box is the slope of that line drawn to the parent parabola. So now we're going to work through some word problems. We're going to do 22 through 25 on the next slides. Okay, question 22 says, find the slope of the tangent line to the graph of y equals x squared at the point where x equals -1/2. So I know m will equal 2x. If my x is -1/2, then my slope will be negative, the 2's cancel, -1. So that's 22. Okay, 23, they say, write the equation of the tangent line to the graph of y equals x squared at the point where x is 1.5. So if x is 1.5, I'm just going to sketch it down here. So it's, say, if it's roughly there, then I would like the equation of the tangent line drawn right there. I see the slope is going to be positive, so let's start working out our equation. So I know if x is 1.5, then y minus 1.5 squared. Now I find it easier if 1.5, I also can write it as 3/2. If I write it as 3/2, look how much easier this is. 3/2 squared to get the y will be 9/4. So I like writing it as fractions. So that's going to equal, my slope is going to be 2 times 1.5, or 2 times 3/2, which is going to be 6/2, which is 3. So my slope is a positive 3. And then I'm going to keep it as a fraction just to be consistent. So that would be 23. 23 would have that equation. Okay, 24 says write the equation of the tangent line to the graph of y equals x squared at the point x equals 0.6. So let me box this off. So if x equals 0.6, I'm also in the first quadrant. So I'm about here, 0.6. So we'll keep this as a decimal. That's a decimal point right there. So far, I know my y1, 0.6 times 0.6 is 0.36. That's going to equal 2 times 0.6 is 1.6. Excuse me, 1.2. That is my, it's a little decimal, that's my slope, and then I'm going to kind of go sideways here. X minus 0.6 is the rest of my line. So that would be question number 24. Question number 25 involves us to work backwards. So let's do that one on the next slide. So here's question number 25, and it says to find the point on the graph of y equals x squared where the curve has a slope of 5/3. Alright, so I'm going to draw my graph. If my slope is 5/3, then that means that it's going to be in the first quadrant because that slope is going to be positive. So what do I know? And they're only looking for the point. So what I know is that my slope will always equal 2x. This time I don't know what x is, but I know the slope is 5/3. So 5/3 is going to equal 2x. So divide by 2 and divide this by 2, which is like multiplying by 1/2. So I get an x value of 5/6. If 5/6 is my x value, what's my y value? Well, the y value is the x value squared, so that's going to be 25/36, and that's the point that I'm looking for. Alright, let's go on to other problems on the next slide. Okay, so, I posted the wrong thing there, so hang on, let me just redo this. Okay, question number 27 is a little bit more challenging. So for 27 it says, find the point on the graph of y equals x squared, okay, that's the same, where the tangent line is parallel to the line x plus 2y equals 4. So if you have a line x plus 2y equals 4, and that is parallel to the tangent line, that means it must have the exact same slope as the tangent line. Well, what is this slope? Well, I'm going to write this equation of a line in a form that I can read the slope. So I'm going to isolate the y, and now I'm ready to read the slope. So the slope is 1/2 because the equation is y equals 2 minus 1/2 x. So I'm still looking for the slope. I'm still looking for the point. So I know my slope is negative, don't forget the negative, 1/2. So if my slope is negative 1/2, that has to equal 2x. So divide by 2, which is like multiplying by 1/2. That means my x, so if I multiply this by 1/2, my x is going to be negative 1/4. If my x is negative 1/4, my y will be the square of that, which is positive 1/16, and that is my point. Okay, the next question is very similar, so let's do 28 on the next slide. Okay, for 28, I see that I have the question, find the point on the graph of y equals x squared where the tangent line is parallel to the line. So here we go, very similar to the last one. It's parallel to that line. So we want to isolate our y so I can read my slope. So 3x, I'm going to bring the 2 over, minus 2 equals y. I'm going to write this in the order you usually see it. And I see my slope is 3. If my slope is 3, and I know my slope has to equal 2x, so if 3 equals 2x, then x must be 3/2. If x is 3/2, then y is 9/4, and that's my point. All right, the next problems are going to deal with a different curve, so we're going to do that on the next slide. Okay, so in this slide, we see that we're using the cubic function, and they tell me that the slope is going to be 3x squared. So for 29, if I have the point 2, 8, and they would like me to find the slope of the curve at that point, then I know that my slope is going to equal 3x squared, and if my x value is 2, then I'm going to put 2 in there, and that's going to be 12. So my slope for 29 will be 12. So let's do 30. In this situation, the point is a fraction, 3/2, 27/8. So to find the slope at that point, so let's just draw this so we see where we are. So if we're positive, we're at 1/2 or 3/2, which is right there. So what I'm looking for is the slope of the line drawn tangent right there. So if I'm given my point, then I know that for the cubic function, slope is going to equal 3x squared. Put in your 3/2 where you have your x and square that. So that's 9/4 times 3. So 3 times 9/4 is 27/4. So my slope in that situation would be 27/4. Okay, so let's go on to 31 because we're dealing with a negative there, and we'll do that on the next slide. For 31, the point is negative 1/2, negative 1/8. So again, my slope for this function is going to be 3x squared. If I have my x, I have a negative 1/2, and I square that. That is a positive 1/4, and my slope would be 3/4. Okay, for 32, they ask us to write the equation of the line tangent to the graph. So let's do that on the next slide. Okay, so for 32, it says that x is going to be negative 1. So let's see what that looks like. Here is my curve. Say this is negative 1. So that's my point on the curve, and I'm looking for the equation of the tangent line right there. So it looks like it's going to have a positive slope from what I've drawn so far. So let's set up our equation. Remembering again that the line is x cubed and the slope is 3x squared. So y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1. They gave us the x1, but the x1 is going to flip that to a positive 1. If I cube negative 1, negative 1 times negative 1 times negative 1 is still negative 1, and I don't want to put the m here. So what's our slope going to be? Well, our slope off to the side here is 3 times x squared, and x was negative 1. Negative 1 squared is positive 1, and 3 times 1 is 3, and we're done. And that does look like it's consistent with the tangent line that I've just drawn. So that's 32. So now we're going to go to some other problems that have us interpret graphs, and we'll do that on the next slide. Okay, for question 33 in the textbook, they want us to figure out a, f of a, and the slope. So what I'm noticing is that they have drawn the tangent line to that curve, and they've written it in slope-intercept form. So right away, I know that the slope, let me just get a different color, the slope is right there. It's at 2. So for 29, what I know by just looking at my curve is that my slope at that point is 2, because I'm reading off the tangent line. So now my question is, what's point A? Well, remembering that slope on a parabola is always going to be 2x, if I know the slope is 2 and 2 has to equal 2x, then x must be 1. So this a is 1. If a is 1, f of a is 1 squared, which is also 1. So I have my point. So my a equals 1, and my f of a also equals 1, because 1 squared is 1. Okay, so that wasn't too bad. So let's go on to 34 on the next slide. So in problem 34, they have something similar. So what I'm seeing is they have drawn a tangent line right over here, and they've given me the equation of that tangent line in slope-intercept form, so I can see right away that the slope is going to be negative 1, because the coefficient to the x is negative 1. So I have that already. Now I know on the parabola, the slope will always equal 2x. So if slope is negative 1, so my x must be negative 1/2. So that's my a. A equals negative 1/2, which is consistent with the second quadrant, so that's good. And then f of a is going to be negative 1/2 squared, which is 1/4. So I have all three of the features that I wanted to have. So we're going to go on to one more curve that is a little bit more complicated. Okay, focus on 35. And what I see is I have a curve f of x. And that curve is neither a parabola nor a cubic function. So I'm looking at that. They still want me to figure out the slope of the curve at point A, and they want me to figure out f of a, and they want me to figure out the a, f of a, and slope. So look at the two lines that they've drawn. They've drawn y equals 1/2 x. That curve goes through, so let's just see if I can highlight that for you. I'll just use a marker. So look at this y equals 1/2 x. That goes right through. So that is not a tangent line. So we can't rely upon that for the slope of the curve. But look at the other curve, y equals 1/4 x plus 1. That's this. And you can see that that is indeed a tangent line. So that's the one I can use to get the slope. So right away, I know that my slope is going to be positive 1/4 at point F, or point A on f of x. I don't know what x is. I don't have any kind of relationship that I can fall back upon. So what I'm going to have to do is set those two curves equal and do it as simultaneous equations. So what I know is that y at that point equals 1/2 x, and y will also equal 1/4 x plus 1. So set these two equations equal. 1/2 x equals 1/4 x plus 1. 1/2 x minus 1/4 x is going to equal 1. So what's 1/2 x minus 1/4 x? You should be saying it's 1/4 x equals 1. So if that's the case, to get x by itself, I multiply that side by 4 and that side by 4, and I get x equals 4. So x is my a, so a is going to equal 4. How do I get f of a? Well, I can use either this equation or that equation, and I'll get the same value because they share a y value. So take your 4 and plug it into 1/2 x, and 1/2 of 4 is 2. So my f of a is going to be 2. All right, for homework, I asked you to do question 36 to make sure we understand this whole concept. So I'm going to do that on the next slide, but you should try to do it independently to make sure you understand this, and then you can check my work. So let's do that last thing on the next slide. Okay, so here's question 36. They want my a, my f of a, and the slope. So once again, you're going to need to figure out which one is the tangent line. And so looking at the top line, I see that line is right there. That looks tangent to the curve. So I am thinking that I'm going to use that line for my slope because it's the tangent line to the curve. So let me just erase that so we can see a little bit better. So do you see how this second curve is this, and that goes right through the f of x curve, and therefore that's not tangent, so I cannot use that for the slope. So let's see what we have so far. If I pull off the slope from this top line, I know that my slope is equal to -1. Okay, so slope is -1. Now, I don't have, that f of x curve is neither the parabola nor the cubic, so I'm going to have to get my x and y values, or a and f of a values, by using these two equations, setting them equal, and solving for the x that they have in common. So if you're going to put this in your graphing calculator, for example, you can say y1 is 2 minus x, and y2 is -1/5 x plus 6/5, and you would graph them and look for the intersection and get your x and y that way. We are going to instead set them equal and solve for the x. Okay, so I have 2 minus 6/5 equals -1/5 x plus 1. Okay, so how do I do 2 minus 6/5? So 2 is really 10/5. So let's just make this 10/5. So 10/5 minus 6/5 is going to give me 4/5. We're going to use this little area. So 4/5 equals, okay, what if you have, and this is 1x? What if you have negative 1/5 x plus 1x? So isn't that 1x? So let me erase the 1, and can't that be 5/5? So then don't I have negative 1/5 x plus 5/5? Isn't that positive 4/5? So this is 4/5 x, and for 4/5 x to equal 4/5 x has to equal 1. So that means that my a is 1. What's my f of a? Well, if I use either of these curves, I can get my y value, which is my f of a. So let's use this one because it's easy. So 2 minus the x of 1 gives me 1 for my y. So my point, or my f of a, is 1, my a is 1, and my slope is negative 1, and that solves that problem. So let's just recap on the next slide. So to recap, if they give us the parabola y equals x squared, the slope of any tangent line drawn to that parabola is 2x, and then we can answer any question that they ask us about that if we know that relationship. The second curve that they've given us is this curve, the cubic. When y equals x cubed, the slope of any tangent line drawn to that curve is going to equal 3x squared. And that's the essence of the whole lesson. So you're ready for the quiz on this section if you understand these problems.